For the Guardian, so I don't think I need to say any more. Please welcome James.
So, afternoon guys, really nice to be here, especially after wondering whether I was going to spend my time on a waterlogged train for a while when we stopped. So yes, I'm going to try to do not a planned talk, but instead walk you through a rough idea of my last 24 hours, because I think, hopefully, if I tell it anything like coherently, it's a reasonable idea of how journalism works a few years into your career, and also, hopefully, about how it's changing, and not just in bad ways. I think, certainly, I remember when I trained, a good chunk of every talk seemed to be about how no one would get a job, and how it would be awful, and how everything's over, and the industry's declining, and people showing you readership numbers, and it's not much fun, and actually there is good stuff happening as well, and so hopefully I can go into it. I'm also going to try and give plenty of time for questions, because I always found that brilliant as absolutely eminent people like Jon Snow and the legend that is Harry Gratian, who I'm gutted to have missed, since I spent sort of years watching him on television coming up, is that really, in terms of what it's like when you're starting out, they either don't remember, or it's so long ago that it has very little to do with it. I apologise, I'm leaning on the lectern, but I'm on strict orders not to pace around, and it's the only way I can stop myself. So yeah, I'd intended to sort of have a quiet sort of day or two in Yorkshire, and then come across to here after a well-rested weekend, and that wasn't really how it worked out. As I'm sure everyone knows now, WikiLeaks has released the latest set of a cache of 5 million emails which were got through a hacking attack on a US security company. Essentially, about 2 or 3 days ago, it hinted that it was going to put something out within the next 3 days. And a couple of people started sort of messaging me with what it might be, or asking what it was. And then last night, as it became clear when it was coming, first my news editor and then a couple of other Guardian editors got in touch to see firstly if I knew what it was. I didn't know for sure, which is never a nice thing to have to turn around and say to your editors. But I had a couple of suggestions of what it might be, thankfully one of which was right. It's always lucky when that happens. Unfortunately, I did say it wasn't the one it was likeliest to be, so I don't really get points for that. But it's an interesting sort of start on where you are. I mean, the news cycle is 24 hours now, and for all that I don't work in a day-to-day reporting role, as I'm sure a lot of you know, I'm a data journalist, it still creeps up on you. And certainly, if you want to work in news, and that's the field that you like, you are going to have to live it, probably for as long as you do it. It's really, you're not going to get regular hours too much. Now, that might take the form of shift patterns, and you know, no one likes earlies, no one likes lights on a Friday night. Or if it doesn't, it may well take the part of just, essentially, in theory you have nice office hours, in practice, when there's something in your patch, you've got to be on it. And hopefully that's part of the fun as well. So, WikiLeaks released the first sort of cache of material at about midnight, and then we had to make essentially a string of snap judgments. It was right in the middle of the US Oscars ceremony, and so our American audience, which is pretty big, was kind of busy looking at the red carpet, and to be honest, looking at the traffic figures wasn't going to be distracted from that. So there was the question of whether there was the appetite to try and bite on it immediately. There's also the issue of, this is a very contentious release. This is pretty much definitely now, we've established, obtained through an illegal hack on a private company's servers. And that's quite hard to justify publishing that material, even though it wasn't a result of our hack and so on, without a very good public interest explanation. And so we're left at midnight trying to decide if that's there. There's also the issues of, is it authentic? Has anything incorrect slipped out there? Does what's in the press release actually match what's in the data? And it's well worth remembering this time, you know, the Guardian got this when everyone else did. On other occasions, we've had to look through 270,000 diplomatic cables. That's a hell of a lot of words. I can tell you there's no way you'd read them. 400,000 Iraqi war logs, all of this kind of stuff. Now, the good news for you guys, if you can be bothered to learn different skills in some ways, is that journalists aren't very good at that. I mean, no one's very good at that. It's hard. But knowing tricks to handle big data, to handle big bits of documents, is a skill that isn't in newsrooms, and is a skill newsrooms are starting to get. 4 or 5 years ago, there was no such thing in the UK as a data journalist. It was something Heatherbrook and 2 or 3 other people were trying out. Now, there's people explicitly hiring for them, both in print, online, and in television now. You can get jobs at ITN, Channel 4 News, through data skills. You can get them at production companies for dispatches. You can get them on Newsnight or Panorama. It's whatever type of journalism you want to do, understanding numbers, understanding data will give you an edge that isn't in the newsroom already, and is kind of how I got to do stories like WikiLeaks, basically at the time, 2 years into my career. So at midnight we had lots of judgment calls to make, and essentially made the decision to do a holding story and reassess. And I think that was probably the right call, but it did mean I essentially wrote a piece at about 2 o'clock in the morning, which I don't know if any of you've read, maybe 1 or 2 of you have. It's not inspiring, it's fine. I think I got it right, which is the key thing, but definitely don't write my best prose at that hour. But looking again at it this morning and having read virtually all of the emails and the reports, I think the call backs it up. When you look in the cache, the material is weaker than you might think. Things that have been reported as, say, Goldman Sachs setting up a business partnership with this intelligence agency, turns out to be a former employee of Goldman Sachs setting up a partnership. Reports that a company hired them to spy on some activists turns out to be media monitoring, which is basically a Google search on your name, which I could advise you, if you've annoyed anyone on the internet ever, just don't do. Really don't. So I think sometimes, even in 24 hours, news cycles, all of these, slow is better than fast, and right is better than first. I'm very boring for saying that, but I think the media sometimes makes itself part of the problem with these things. Everyone likes to point to MMR, and that was a complicated situation, but the media didn't do itself favours in coverage for that, and there's lots of ways we can avoid it just by stopping to think about a story, checking the numbers, and just being a bit sensible about it. And I think the more reporters that learn how to do that, the better the media's reputation is, the better a reputation for getting stuff right, getting numbers right you get, and as I say, those are the skills that aren't in the newsrooms. However, when you start, however good your contacts book is, most people who've been doing it for 5 years will have a better one. They'll have been writing every day for 5 years, they'll have been doing other things. You have to look at what you can do that they can't. And the other side of that hopefully comes to what I ended up doing today, which actually ended up being probably the more controversial of the 2 stories. You have the secret intelligence leak as a result of a hack and all of this. Turns out that wasn't what got me shouted at on the internet today. What did was Scotland. It's always Scotland. We are, I don't know how much people know, but the Guardian has this idea of open journalism, and that's kind of not just saying that we as journalists know what we're doing, we'll finish a story and then show it to you, but that where we can, we'll take things from the audience, we'll take some interaction, we'll see what's going on and incorporate that. And a lot of the time that helps. You see that in things that look like quite straightforward stories, like our workfare coverage. Each time we've covered it, more people have come forward with figures, with evidence, with freedom of information requests, or all kinds of stuff, or just personal stories. You saw it with the coverage of Ian Tomlinson's death, where essentially a witness published a video, and one of our journalists, Paul Lewis, took it seriously enough to meet the guy, watch it, and I mean, that turned into an absolutely huge story and a huge scandal. It happens with the riots, and one of the ways that we try and do that is things like reality checks. So this week we're looking into what happens if Scotland becomes independent. And I can tell you, some people, it turns out, have some quite strong feelings on that. And they're not shy about expressing them. And in a column that's called Reality Check, in which we explicitly state, if we make assumptions, we say whose assumptions they are. If we use reasoning, we say whose it is. We try and set out the numbers. You would think I'd basically said that independent Scotland was an awful idea and should be set on fire for some people. Incidentally, if you've got to tweet that, don't cut off the "you'd basically think" bit, or it's going to end badly for all of us. But it's another good example of how journalism's changing, though, because for all that I'm taking the mick out of a couple of people with very strong views, the comments in that discussion were incredibly helpful and have informed the rest of the piece through the day and have been passed on to people doing other stuff at the end of the week. These reality checks now often, as well as being quite successful blogs in their own right, they're almost always in the top read politics pieces at the end of the week, hits in the tens of thousands, all of these being good things. They inform our stories, they give us sources of news stories, they give us a good idea of what we're getting right and wrong on the detail, and better than that, they can also be repackaged later in the week as things like fact boxes or explainers next time we do a big paper or web story on something. So we get really good value out of this content as well as a good discussion. Now that doesn't just come from me sitting there doing the post. We have what are called, in our newsroom, community coordinators. Other places they're called sort of community editors or anything like that. And today, two of them, Laura Oliver and Hannah Waldron, who if you mention on Twitter, please add them in or they'll just think I'm being mean and doing it on purpose. They've both been in the comments thread during the day, checking things, steering the discussion, and also when something's particularly relevant or interesting, emailing it to me as I've done other stuff. Now, they're among a very small number of people who've been hired by the Guardian in the last couple of years, and they were hired because they had skills that people in the newsroom didn't. And that's learning how to treat journalism as a conversation, how to work it across social networks, how to host Q&As, how to essentially feed into things, even like the Arab Spring coverage last year. They would sit in the comments and look for where people looked to be doing first-hand reporting, get in touch with them by email, try to get phone numbers, try to verify what they were doing. They're very clearly journalistic roles, but they feel very different, certainly than what I do and what most people think of, certainly when they think of reporting roles. But they're one of the areas of journalism that's really growing and that's really working. There's certainly not a broadsheet now in the UK that doesn't have at least one of these people, and most of them have at least sort of 2, 3, 4, and I can see that expanding, certainly within what we do. So I think part of what makes a functional journalistic career, and I say that with great trepidation, as I'm only about 4 or 5 years into a very odd one, if you look at my career progression, I bounce around the place, is trying to work out what bits of journalism that are new, interest and excite you, and trying to get those skills and those specialisms, because the one thing I just really worry is people who walk out able to do an interview, pick up the phone, do shorthand, all of these, they're all essential, they're all as important as they were, but they're not going to be enough, especially in the climate. And so my kind of pitch, as it were, is to try and find some new skills. No one goes into journalism because they like maths. I mean, precisely no one, including me, and I'm a nerd. You've got to find the ways where you can tell a story that other people can't. And whether that's contributing using tech skills and social media, whether that's using multimedia, although more and more people are coming through multimedia train now. 10 years ago you knew how to work a camera as well as write and go online, and they'd probably hire you as editor somewhere. It's not quite the case anymore, but it's still a tick. But find what you can do that other people can't, and then get really good at it. Which is probably really boring advice. I'm going to leave it at that. I could quite happily talk to you more about data or about things that we've done at the Guardian, things like reading the riots or the Guantanamo files. Happy to talk to you about the latest WikiLeaks release. If there's a vehement Scottish nationalist in the audience who I've just managed to really offend, I will cheerfully take on board your constructive criticism. But yes, and feel free to ask, even if it's something that you think's daft, like how did you get your first job type stuff. If you think it's a helpful question, I'll answer it, or try to. Hi.
Just about the coverage of the London riots, not specifically to the Guardian or anything, but many different companies. It was sort of a bit biased, and it was sort of a bit, they demonised certain demographics. Earlier on I asked Johnson the same question, and he said it's because they couldn't really find a real cause of the riots, so they sort of marketed it to one pitch, one sort of angle, and that angle was, this is angry young people, or angry chavs, or angry hoodies, or whatever. What is your opinion on that kind of thing, and the demonisation of certain demographics during the London riots?
I think it happened. I think it's hard to deny that happened. I think a lot of people on the ground did absolutely fantastic work. I think of people like Mark Stone at Sky News. I think in particular of my colleague Paul Lewis, who I think managed to go from 5,000 Twitter followers to 40,000 during that week, which we still all grossly envy him for. He's even got a little verified tick. But they did very good work, and in a lot of cases did try to talk to people, although it's not the best environment to talk to someone, even if you're trying to give them a fair hearing. I think when people are stoked up on adrenaline and looting, you're maybe not going to get good answers from them. And as we sat down in the aftermath of that, we actually realised that, and we actually engaged in what was, for phase 1, about a 3-month project where we actually partnered with a university and tried to interview, with the promise of anonymity, hundreds of rioters. And we compared their answers. Firstly, we did really long academic quality interviews with each, about 45 minutes each, and we spoke to 250 from memory, which is about 20 times more than any official panel did, any of the government inquiries did. And we did 6 days of coverage, front page each day, I believe, and at least two spreads in the print delivery of what they said to us, what they said the causes were, going through it, looking at whether social media was a cause or not, tying it in. We worked with, one very good LSE academic was the lead, but we also worked with about 6 academics on analysing tweets during the riots and looking at whether technology was to blame. We got some very negative coverage from some places, including the Mail, who said we were running essentially the opposite problem to what you said, that we were being apologists for it, or that we were... But essentially, our rationale was that no one lots of people were speaking to the victims, and that was absolutely right. Lots of people were speaking to the police, and that was absolutely right. No one seemed to be actually trying to speak to the people who did it. And we thought, whatever you think of their actions, however much you condone them, they're interesting and they add to the debate. And we decided that academic way of doing it was the best way to. And we were very lucky we got funding for it, or we never could have afforded it. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation and Open Society Foundation supported it. But that was actually the first time a journalistic organisation and academic organisation worked together in that way since the Detroit riots in 1967. So we stole the idea. We freely admit that, but it was very hard. It was very hard. 3 months is forever for a newspaper, although for the amount of work we did, nothing. But for academics to work in that timescale was amazing. It's all still online as well, guardian.co.uk, reading the riots. And we're doing panels around the country now. Sorry, I'm on strict orders to wait for the microphone, and I'm generally scared of people.
Hi, Julian Assange has just started his own show on Russia Today, which is now state-run. Do you think it's kind of hypocritical that someone who's made his name in releasing documents about governments and corporations and things is now working for a government that he would release things on?
Well, I wonder if Julian would release anything on Russia at the minute. Yeah, Julian. Let's firstly say in defence to him, he says the show is entirely independently produced, and that Russia Today, or RT as it now calls itself, has just licensed it. It is at the minute the only channel that's licensed it. But RT isn't the BBC. It quite often runs some fairly naked Kremlin propaganda, and there's reasonable sets of things showing its influence. It has some very interesting opinions on Barack Obama that even Fox News won't run. And that's saying something. I do worry about the extent to which that compromises you. I mean, it is a channel funded by the Kremlin, and the Kremlin has, however bad Julian Assange feels America's record is with journalists, and it isn't, and freedom of expression, that it isn't perfect. There are many journalists and activists who've either been intimidated or killed, with lots of evidence pointing towards the Russian state. And it's hard to see how a TV show backed by the Kremlin isn't a tacit endorsement of that. Assange is also kept in quite close association with people who support the government of Belarus, which is a dictatorship as well, and another Soviet-friendly one. So, yes, I think it's hypocritical. On the other hand, as I'm sure Julian would point out, freedom of speech includes freedom of speech for Kremlin propaganda pieces, so he's well within his rights to do it, just as I am well in my rights to say I think it's hypocritical, and I think it's a shame rather than something to be angry about. It's a pity. Hi.
It's been recently announced that Bradley Manning, the US Army guy who released the documents, is nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. Do you think what he did is worthy of a nomination? Do you think it's brought peace?
$1 million question there. I mean, firstly, let's say everything against Bradley Manning is alleged, nothing's proven, he's innocent unless proven guilty, and no one knows for sure whether he's the leaker or not. If we work on the assumption that whoever did leak it, I think what's been said around Manning and the motivations and the things that have come out apparently about his reasons to do so, I think are pretty noble. I think he was an individual working under extreme stress in really tough circumstances, and we shouldn't forget that and turn someone into a sort of comic book hero. You know, I think he's a genuine, flawed character. But when you look at what was behind the release and what the impacts of it were, I think that it's hard to see the definitive ones. I mean, it's certainly even Bill Keller, who I think has got more and more downbeat on the consequences of WikiLeaks, says that it could have been some kindling on the flames that were the Arab Spring. I quite like that as a phrase. I certainly don't think they were a cause, but they certainly gave useful information that may have contributed. I think we haven't seen them cause huge upset to US operations, but they have shed light on things that I would hope, as a result, will not happen again. We learned the full scale of what happened in Iraq. We learned Barack Obama willingly turned people over for Barack Obama's administration willingly turned people over to the detention of the Iraqi government, despite knowing that they were carrying out torture. That's against the Geneva Convention. We learned the full extent of what happened in Guantanamo Bay. We learned all kinds of other things. And call me naive, I don't think the people in power in the US wanted much of that to happen. I think these happened because of cultures of secrecy, because of cultures of incompetence, and because of paranoia. And hopefully they'll be harder to happen again in the future. So yes, in those circumstances, maybe Manning should get a Nobel. So you've sort of got two opposite corners, so I'll go with whoever.
Like, just wondering, why did the Guardian and Julian Assange fall out so badly?
So it's one of these how long's a piece of string questions. I think by this point, Julian Assange sees David Lee as the devil incarnate. I think David Lee is very bored with Julian Assange. It's always put down as a kind of personality clash, and there's no doubt that Julian is a difficult man to work with, but I think it actually goes further than that. There were some very real concerns starting to air about people who were being given access to the cables and who were selling them either to quite dodgy outlets with connections you wouldn't want, either to criminal gangs in Russia or a few African outlets which were generally happier to cozy up to their dictator than try and expose them. And then the details around the cables seemingly being sold to the Belarusian government. I think Guardian and other outlets lost trust in WikiLeaks' ability to protect sources within the cables, to protect the cables themselves, and to sort of honour the agreements. There was also, it was an incredibly fatiguing operation for everyone involved, trying to keep 5 papers on a publishing schedule, even without WikiLeaks, even without the unbelievable amount of government pressure it was under. Was always got to be a frayed relationship at the best of times. But so I think the sort of soap opera style tensions, coupled with what were and are quite grave concerns about WikiLeaks, which I mean I can attest to firsthand, they happened, I think led to the souring of relations as it did. I think.
Did you get on with him?
Very much not. I worked reasonably hard to leave under civil terms, and I think it's fair to say I completely failed. But yes, I kept my mouth shut about a lot of what had upset me there until a good 6-7 months after I left, to try and keep some internal voice and some internal pressure even after I'd gone. And when they were just continually not changing. And I think the thing is, WikiLeaks' spin means they feel a need to be perfect, and no news organisation is perfect. Everywhere gets stuff wrong. I think WikiLeaks' desire to be infallible, despite the fact it's small, it's chaotic, and was working under stress that most organisations, let alone most people, could believe, meant it made mistakes. And it just seemed to get in a little run of denial that they were happening. And that just meant the gap between wiki reality and reality got bigger. And so eventually I started sort of saying, what had gone on and what hadn't gone on within, along with a few bits about why not many other people were saying so. So yes, I don't think we're on Christmas card lists at the minute. It's probably good I didn't go to the press release today. I'll add, if you're on that side of the room, I basically can't see you because of that quite bright studio light. So if you're going for attention, I'm ignoring you. Don't worry about it.
We've got a school group on campus today listening to you here, Buttershaw Business and Enterprise College, and I was just wondering, what were you doing when you were 17 towards your career in journalism, and how did you get into journalism?
With hindsight, not enough, I don't think. I used to do a bit of school paper type stuff, and tragically I actually did the Young Enterprise scheme, which, given I've ended up a journalist, shows that business probably wasn't my thing, because some people in my group were very good at it, and me less so, which I think is why I write words and get that kind of pay for a living. But no, I mean, I did extracurricular I was interested in, and I think that's a good thing, and eventually that stuff becomes your job, really, especially if you go into the professions. So yeah, I started fairly late. I really only started doing much journalism once I got to university. I didn't do a journalism degree as my first degree, but found I was spending more time working on student papers or trying to get stuff into nationals or whatever than doing my actual course. And so I sort of figured, once I graduated from that, I did manage to get myself graduated, thankfully. I then did a journalism qualification and worked as a journalist during it. So yeah, I didn't know I wanted to be a journalist at 17. So I think if you don't quite know what you want to be doing yet, it's not a problem, hopefully. So that's probably really bad advice, sorry. Anyone? Hi.
How did you get involved with WikiLeaks?
It was a sort of strange string of connections. I was working for the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, and a guy on the board of that called Gavin McFadden was friends with Julian, and so when the Guardian put out the Afghan war logs, he got in touch to see if they might want to do any television stuff on the next set, which we'd all realised was coming. And so ended up meeting Julian Assange at about 11 o'clock on a Saturday night in a Turkish restaurant with an Al Jazeera commissioner and 2 or 3 other people from the office, which is apparently fairly standard with Julian as first meetings go. And so we sort of had the dinner, and then we sort of went back to these sort of very odd little ante-rooms above the Frontline Club in London, where Julian gave us a briefing on roughly what was in these Iraq war logs, and then pretty much everyone else left, and Julian decided he was ready to give us them. So as I hung around for about an hour, he did a copy of them and gave me a USB stick with 400,000 secret military documents on it, as you do. Now, at this point, it's about 1:30 on a Sunday morning, and I'm heading to leave the room, and sort of 2 or 3 WikiLeaks people in there, and it's James. Yeah, where are you going from here? It's like, well, it's 1:30. I'm going home. It's like, no, don't do that. Can you find somewhere else to go for 3 or 4 hours? Because I think this place is being watched, and I don't want your address linked to mine. Obviously, you say yes because you've just been given this stuff. So, had to find. Basically, turned up on a friend's doorstep saying that I'd lost my keys. Tried to sort of stop them rattling. Thankfully got let in, and sort of did me a hot chocolate and set me up on the sofa, and sort of she turned to look at me and went, hang on a sec, James, yeah, you're not drunk. So that was reassuring. 6 weeks later, when I told her why I'd turned up, She was at first sort of laughing and happy, and then gave me a very stern look and asked me why I was happy to lead the CIA to her house and not to mine. Didn't really have a good answer. But yes, that was how I met Julian. So, anything else? Hi.
Hi. Just wondering, looking at it from both a legal and a moral point of view, is there any difference between News International paying the police versus us taking for free what Anon have hacked out of Stratfor's archives? I mean, they both involve breaking of the law, and they both involve publishing that kind of material along kind of legal and moral lines that aren't that clear. Would you say there's a similarity or a difference?
I think you're right that you start to jump into some grey areas. I'm not sure that's the comparison I would have chosen. I think the issue with paying police and actually other public officials, people in job centres, this isn't necessarily the Sun, I will stress, but there's science people in job centres have improperly accessed people's records. At least 500 in the last few years, 100 people have been sacked for it. What worries me is 400 people have improperly accessed records and not been sacked. You know, military officials elsewhere, there's allegations in all kinds of bits of public life, and these are people we trust with our private information, and if people are selling it, it's not like it's public interest whistleblowing, or there's necessarily anything other than some salacious gossip or something that will help a journalist track someone down in it. And so, for me, that's not really a grey area. I think that's just flat out not okay. Where you start to get more into tricky territory is when you look at allegations of email hacking. The Times has admitted one of its reporters hacked an email account. It sounds a lot to me like that was an isolated incident. There's allegations of email hacking against other papers. I think we generally agree that's clearly wrong. It's just not the way journalists should behave in the UK. That makes using this latest set of information quite hard because we know it was got by anonymous hacking. I genuinely don't believe that would have been solicited by WikiLeaks. Knowing the way Anon operate, that's very much off their own back, and then passing it to WikiLeaks is what they've decided to do with it. I honestly don't know what decision we would have made if we'd have been approached as one of the organisations. It would have been well above my pay grade. But my instinct is that were there material of great public interest in there, we could probably justify publishing, given it was not a solicited hack, it was not commissioned in any kind of way by the media organisations involved. If they've made the decision that the bits of it they publish are public interest, I think that's probably an okay decision, is my personal view. I think it's trickier if it starts to become an established route for getting material and tacit agreements slip in. And I think other people would probably feel like you should just say, never touch anything to do with hacking. It's worth noting, though, that the initial releases, which I think a lot of people working in journalism would say are public interest, you know, the Iraq war logs, the Afghan war logs, all of that, because Manning allegedly exceeded his authority and the access he should have had to the documents to get them, the US government says that they were obtained through hacking as well. I think that's a view many people would dispute. I would dispute it. I think they're more whistleblowing than hacking, but you're never going to get a nice black and white line of this okay, this not. It's journalism is all about the grey areas, especially when you start getting towards anything investigative. If you feel comfortable, you're probably doing something quite safe. And you've probably not looked at libel law yet. It's, once you know libel law, you never feel comfortable. Thanks. Hey. So, go either way.
Given your experience of kind of going through documents and what have you, do you often find the best information is kind of on page 87 of the 88-page document, for instance?
Not usually that near the end. It's usually hidden somewhere in the middle. But yes, it's more and more it's sort of knowing what you're looking for, because there is, for every time you find an amazing nugget on page 54 of something, and it happens, you more often find absolutely nothing and you've read 87 pages. So you can try and sort of do things through sheer hard work, but I think most of us get worn out before we find stuff there. I think it helps when you're chasing a clear story, which was not necessarily an advantage we had with WikiLeaks. I think we had to work in different ways with that. But generally speaking, if you were trying to look for interesting stories from the Department for Work and Pensions, say, the sheer volume of material that comes out between Commons, outside publications, all of that, you would never get through. Once you're starting to chase a particular line of story, like the so-called workfare programs, which Shiv Malik and myself have been doing work on for the last couple of weeks, then when people point you to big reports and say there might be something in this, because you're looking for stuff in particular and you've got to know the area, that's when you start finding things hidden away on page 54. I would suggest, especially if you ever get into business journalism, never ever trust the press release that comes with company accounts. And a good 2/3, 3/4 of business journalists do. The amount of write-ups I see in good publications where it's just a press release that goes with a company's financial statements that's published. Learn to read. Financial statements all come down to 3 pages. If you can learn to read 3 pages of numbers, you'll get exclusive financial stories for a full career. And you'll also be the reporter that companies are really scared of. And that's kind of cool, because you then get to have dinner with their scary PRs as well as their nice ones. So yes, do try to get past the first few pages if you can, but know what you're looking for. Hi.
Just interestingly, how would you define public interest, and do you think it's often used as an excuse to whistleblow about something that isn't really newsworthy?
I mean, I'm going to cheat and say that's also a $1 million question. But yes, it's one of those where it's very tempting to say you know it when you see it, and I hope that you do. But generally, certainly with sources and so on, people think something they disagree with is public interest. So if someone doesn't like a policy or something like that, they may feel justified leaking it, whereas normally they wouldn't. Whether that's overall public interest, who knows? I think for us as journalists, it has to mean that it has to come down to being something a bit more than something our readers like. And that's maybe a bit of a sort of broadsheet view. And I don't know, I hope you have a tabloid reporter in here sometime sort of to give a different view. And maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't. But I think there's plenty of things we could do that would get content Guardian readers like. And there's nothing wrong with just doing a little bit of crowd pleasing. But I think when it comes down to leaked material or anything sensitive, it has to be about more than just something that the readers will like, something that will sell papers. There has to seem to be an issue of public or national importance. I think it's always going to be such a subjective judgment, though, that you're never going to have clear definitions. And I suspect the legal system has come to a very similar conclusion, because I think if public interest could have been tightly defined, it would have been done a long time ago, given the way it works in our country. Do I think public interest is used as an excuse? Yes. It's the easiest defence to jump to, certainly in the press, for anything you run. And so, of course it is, but that doesn't mean it's not a real thing as well.
Hi. I was just sort of wondering what kind of stuff you did at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism and sort of what sort of effects you think the Leveson inquiry might have on investigative journalism.
Given what I did at the Bureau, I don't know how related the two will be, but I'll have a go at both bits. So at the Bureau, I did a couple of sort of data-driven bits that were sort of quite laborious, actually. I helped coordinate a team that sent FOIs to every public body in the UK, and there are thousands of them, asking how many people they had paid over £100,000. That made part of a panorama in 2010, which I will plug and say was the highest rated of the year, but was an absolute agonising bit of effort. I contributed to a couple of bits for some Al Jazeera films on pharmaceuticals and doing some investigations into those and profits off certain types of drugs of dubious worth. And I did a reasonably big expose on Zach Goldsmith, which resulted in a absolutely spectacular 10-minute row between him and Jon Snow. And I cannot recommend it enough. It's great fun because they just get really angry with each other. I'll add that obviously we were on the side of right. We'd done the night before a 10-minute film looking at whether he'd spent too much in the UK election, which if you do on purpose or by accident gets you thrown out. He refused, we gave him a week's warning, he refused to do any interviews, any of that. Then while we were on air, gave an interview to Sky, which we aired. He then put on his blog the next day that he would be coming on Channel 4 if they had the balls to let him on the next day. So of course we said yes. And so I was up in the galley talking into Jon Snow's ear, which was fun. And they had 3 minutes planned for the interview, and it went on for about 12. They cancelled a commercial break and all but one other item in the show to keep it running because it was good. Twitter at the time was all turn on Channel 4 now, OMG kind of stuff. So it did pretty well. I probably really oversold it now. It's sort of two men shouting at each other. But Goldsmith took us to Ofcom and saying that he hadn't had enough representation, despite the fact he'd had longer on air than the broadcast. It took Ofcom 10 months to clear us. They cleared us on every single point, but that took 10 months, and that was a very straightforward investigation. We probably spent longer legaling, even before that, even before it went on air, we probably spent longer legaling that piece of work than doing the journalism on it. In fact, we definitely did. The number of meetings I had with their lawyer was ridiculous. And this wasn't Channel 4 being fussy or anything like that. They did absolutely the right thing. They were a really great operation, ITN. But it was very painful. I'll add the Electoral Commission did an investigation to Goldsmith where they found he'd probably overspent by at least £1,100, but they didn't think it was in the public interest to prosecute. So that was a real technical victory that didn't get us anywhere. But that makes me worry about statutory regulation. For whatever people say about it, I think Ofcom tries to be a good regulator. I think TV News does some very good things despite it. Thought last Thursday's Dispatches was a nice example of that. But it does have a chilling effect. TV spends more on lawyers than print, certainly. It finds it harder. Undercover work is harder to do than ever it was. And I think to pretend that we can curb tabloid excesses with no effect on quality journalism is probably a fantasy. It doesn't matter what type of journalism people are trying to constrain when they make new rules and new laws. It gets everything eventually. So I'm not saying do nothing, but we need to think really carefully, and we can't pretend it's going to come without a cost. Sorry, that's very grim. I tend to be grim. Hi.
Going back to what you said earlier when you thought someone was following you, or the possibility someone was following you, did it sort of give you a bit of fear that you could be possibly being watched all that time?
It was very strange at WikiLeaks. I mean, intelligence agencies don't follow people around in cars. They just don't need to. So, I mean, I don't think, other than the fact that you got very used to having to do things to stop yourself being followed when you worked for WikiLeaks, eventually you sort of half forget, unless you're thinking about it, that there's no one actually following you. So you used to have to do things like ride both ways on a tube line a couple of times. Really? And the way you would get out to the house that everyone was staying in was to, you'd call a anonymous pay-as-you-go mobile from a payphone and say the time your train was leaving. You would know what stop you were going to, so you wouldn't say what train, any of that. They would then look up the time that your train arrived and meet you at the stations, and then you couldn't turn the phone on, you couldn't have any electrics turned on while you travelled, because your phone lets anyone know where you are very quickly. So no phone, no nothing. Turned up at one point at midnight. Late nights seem to feature in this. In this train station in the middle of nowhere. I'd taken the last train up. It was snowing and it was cold. 2 hours. 2 bloody hours. However glamorous any of this stuff sounds. 2 hours in the cold in Norfolk. Trying to work out whether there's anyone actually coming or not, or whether you're going to have to try and hollow out an igloo or something in a train station car park is not my idea of fun. And so, yeah, you find yourself thinking that everything you do is being tracked and all this sort of stuff. In reality, I don't think it ever was. The ones that actually spooked me since have been, at one point, there was quite a strange and obsessive WikiLeaks fan who a couple of times would just send me little bits of footage of me walking past them. Yeah. Yeah. I'll be honest, that one got me a bit. Tweeted death threats are always slightly chilling as well, because there's just that sense of it could be someone in the same room as you and you wouldn't know. So I never have location services turned on when I tweet. And although I'll be honest, it's probably fairly obvious at the minute where I am. But yeah, I mean, I think you can drive yourself mad with this stuff. I much more often get people wishing me dead than saying they'll actually do it, which I take as a positive step. Set the bar low and jump over it. But yeah, I think most people get through with much less in the way of death threats than I do. I have that kind of personality. But yeah, so yes, you get a bit paranoid about people following you. I think if you talk to anyone involved in the WikiLeaks stuff, they will tell you they had this little paranoid phase where they started sweeping their house for bugs and stuff. But I think people then get over it again.
Rather you than me.
It's, who knows, if there's an intelligence officer listening to all the cack I come out with, they're probably really bored by now. Anyone else? Yeah. Sorry. Definitely cheating to have two, isn't it?
I'll keep it short. Just wonder, how long do you give The Guardian in its print format?
So, well, I can exclusively reveal... No. Sorry, guys. I don't know. I wouldn't miss it if it was gone. I think if anything happens with any papers going web only, I suspect they would try and keep weekend editions for a while. So I think the question would be whether you would lose Monday to Friday papers. And if I'm honest, if I cut out the sort of romanticism of it and the fact that I prefer doing a printed crossword to those awful online ones, I don't know if I would miss a Monday to Friday paper much, because I don't consume my news that way. As to whether it would go soon, I don't know if that's the case. Even at The Guardian, which is pretty web first, I mean, it's explicitly web first. I think digital is still, it used to be 80-20 revenues, print to digital. I think it's moving very fast. It might even have got there, I don't know for sure, but to 70-30. And obviously the intention is to keep moving it further because, I mean, the thing is, it's, you know, print is, however you look at it, it's a sinking ship. It's losing, the market loses 10% a year. If winning is losing 9% a year, I mean, that's what papers count as a win, because that means you are declining less than the market. That's not the story any of us want our careers to be, is it? It's sort of, you know, if you're losing 10% a year, every 10 years you have half the readership you had before. And when you look at that versus, you do honest, cumulative things, it's not no one. That isn't what we want to be doing, and actually it's not the real story of journalism. You know, people look at declining circulations and think that we're in a declining industry. The Guardian is now regularly read by 4 million people a day online. I mean, this was the 16th biggest newspaper in the UK. It's now the 5th biggest news website in the world. And that's true of a hell of a lot of places. More people are looking at the kind of journalism we produce, and actually the kind of journalism the UK produces, than ever have before. There is a really, really good story in there. It's just, it's not a good story in print, and I don't think anyone's worked out the business models yet for digital. But digital does make money, just make it make enough. So, I mean, print, as I say, is somewhere between 70 and 80% of our revenues. I can't imagine we're going to leave those behind too soon. But